Dr. Erica Mallery-Blythe is a special expert at the International Commission on Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, ICBE EMF, and founder of Physicians' Health Initiative for Radiation and Environment, FIRE. She's a UK-trained medical doctor with a decade of experience within hospital medicine. In 2008, she began researching biological effects of non-ionising radiation with a special interest in electromagnetic hypersensitivity, EHS, and susceptible groups such as children. She formally transitioned from clinical medicine to full-time research in 2015. In addition to the affiliations already mentioned, she is also advisor to the Oceania Radiofrequency Scientific Advisory Association, ORSA, advisor for International Guidelines on Non-Ionising Radiation, IGNIA, and an honorary member of the British Society for Ecological Medicine, BSEM. Thank you, Dr. Erica Mallery-Blythe.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me here today to talk about non-ionising radiation in children's health at school, which is a subject of rapidly increasing interest and importance. And I want to just start with this statement from the Royal College of Paediatricians and Child Health. They point out that they're concerned because their report showed many measures of children's health and well-being. Progress had stalled, or in some cases was even in reverse, something rarely seen in high-income countries. And they go on to talk about potential reasons for this, but there's a distinct absence of any discussion about non-ionising radiation and the very large increases we've seen in exposure in this group. I think that's going to change. I think there's going to be more and more discussion about this in both the medical and social forums. So in the next hour, very briefly, we're going to touch on the electromagnetic nature of life itself, an overview of the EM spectrum, exposure limits, evidence of biological interaction, some common misconceptions, conclusions, and moving forward. And then there'll be time for Q&A questions at the end. So what is life? Obviously, I can't answer this in this short talk, but I do want to bring attention to the fact that at a very fundamental level, the most basic level, we are electromagnetic. That declares the presence or absence of life itself, from our brain and neurons through our heart, where you can see the contractions of the atria and then ventricles and the electrocardiogram. Even the muscle has this action potential, which shows the intrinsic electromagnetic nature of all of our physiology. But it's not just these outward fields that are a sign of our physiology. We're two-way transmission antennae, so we also receive cues, very subtle in the case of visible light, for example, to regulate biorhythms like our circadian rhythm. Even our DNA has been found on some level to appear to be a fractal antenna. We're extremely good conductors. Our whole body is a good conductor, and we have the presence of these particles of magnetite and cryptochromes, which in the animal kingdom are used deliberately for electromagnetic fields, for things like migration, navigation, hunting, etc. Now, the electromagnetic spectrum is broad, and everybody knows at this point that ionizing radiation energy sufficient to knock electrons out of their orbit, that damages DNA and leads potentially to cancer if there's enough of it. But for many years, we thought the non-ionizing portion of the spectrum was relatively biologically inert. And that is absolutely not the case. There's evidence that all parts of this spectrum interact with our biology. And you'll notice there's been a lot of talk about blue light recently and how that affects melatonin production, sleep, etc. from screens. But we're going to focus in this talk on the radio frequency and microwave frequency portion. That is what we use for our wireless communicating devices, all of these and so many more that come on the market literally on a moment-to-moment basis. Now, some may try to allay concerns by saying, well, we evolved in an electromagnetic field. We've always had radio frequency in our environments. And to some extent that's true, but it's a gross distortion of the reality we see around us now, which is 10 to the 18 times, that's a billion times higher intensity fields than man evolved with. And you can see from this graph published in the Lancet Journal of Planetary Health how we have filled in those anthropogenic or man-made frequencies in what was previously a radio quiet zone. So you can see in green here how the radio frequency dips at around a gigahertz, and that's the very part of the spectrum we have filled in with these frequencies. Now, you would, I'm sure, expect that there are exposure limits in place to protect your biology. But unfortunately, my colleagues and I at the International Commission on Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, or ICBE-EMF.org, where you'll find this publication, have mapped out 14 assumptions here which are invalid underlying the current exposure limits. These have been distilled down into some bullet points that are really easily digestible for even non-scientists, I think, in our fact sheet here. Now, the group that set the guidelines that we're using here in the UK currently, the ICNIP, they pointed out that they did expect variations in tolerance, especially with children, the elderly, and chronically ill, to these kinds of everyday exposures. And they questioned perhaps they needed separate guidance to safely accommodate them, or they anticipated failure when there were concomitant exposures to synergistic environmental toxicants or underlying health complaints which might elevate sensitivity in the individuals. But unfortunately, they abandoned these really important principles. And you can see here in their fact sheet in 2020 that actually they used the exposure values from adults to set restrictions for children. And there were no further restrictions for those who were hypersensitive either. Now, I'm just going to talk through both of these vulnerable backgrounds and give you a little bit more information about why they made those decisions. So, what they said with regards to children was their core body temperature doesn't increase any further than that of an adult with these exposures. But the problem is that core body temperature is a very crude marker of biological response. It's just one of many facets to this discussion. And interestingly, they actually do theoretically permit a core body temperature rise of up to 1 degree, and in local tissues, several degrees, depending on the site of them. But of course, there are safety factors built in the hope that they're not increasing your core body temperature, because the same set of frequencies as are used in your phone are also used in a microwave oven. And of course, they don't want to physically cook your tissues. But there's an issue here because it's not simply about core body temperature. It's also about very low intensity effects that happen orders of magnitude lower than these body heating effects that are sometimes referred to as non-thermal effects. And the unique anatomy, tissue dielectrics, and physiology of children all make them more vulnerable. You can see in our graphic here from the same publication I mentioned earlier, 5-fold increases in the delicate eyes of a child and up to 30-fold in substructures within the brain, such as the hippocampus. This graphic from Omgandi shows penetration of radiation through the brain of a 5-year-old when compared with that of an adult. And you can see how much more deeply through the brain it penetrates. And the hotspots here in gold on the outside, where they're right next to where the phone is held. Now, you'll find some more references to this kind of information in this publication from Deborah Davis et al. From a few years ago. And I draw your attention to this because if you want to go digging for a lot more science on the vulnerabilities of children, this is a great paper. It's quite substantial and brings a lot of different elements together. One of the things that people often want to know, particularly the scientists in the audience, are the mechanisms of damage. And all of these mechanisms and more have been cited in peer-reviewed publications. The top one here, induction of reactive oxygen species. All of you will know about this on some level because otherwise known as oxidative stress. This is a process which is quite normal. It happens all the time in your body. However, if something is driving it to go faster than you can, then your body can cope with it, that can lead to disease processes. And the reason I say you'll be aware of it is when you encourage your children to eat the rainbow, as we say, lots of brightly coloured fresh fruit and vegetables. The reason you're doing that is because that is a sign that those foods are very high in antioxidants, which we know mop up these damaging free radicals, which cause premature aging and degeneration of cells. And this is a mechanism of action well known for many other carcinogens and environmental toxicants. And all of these others are also felt to play roles, and you can find lots of different papers on those, some of which are cited both in our ICB publication and also the one I mentioned by Deborah Davis, which shows this graphic, bringing some of these different mechanisms together so that you can understand them better. Now, it's no surprise that if you have mechanisms like oxidative stress, for example, that affect multiple different cell lines in multiple different systems, you get multiple different endpoints that can span all of the body. And these were just some of the topics identified recently by the WHO, a nominated set of experts, asking them to score the most critical first. And they scored the most critical at the top left here, moving down to the top right. But you'll see how many different systems those span. We'll come back to those a little later, but in my talk, I'm going to be briefly giving you a bit more information about the evidence concerning head tumours, hypersensitivity, and male fertility. We can't touch on all the others, I'm afraid. So electromagnetic hypersensitivity is a special interest of mine, and it might be more common than you expect. We see estimates varying between 3 and 10%. Now, the reason for this broad range, in my opinion, is because this is a spectrum, a little bit like neurodivergence, where we see very, very mild cases and then very severe disabling cases in other situations. If you go to the WHO landing page, they've got this 2005 backgrounder that I'll just enlarge, where they point out that it's hallmarked by the classical symptoms of things like headache, dizziness, sleep disturbance, and skin symptoms, sometimes burning, rashes, pain, aches, muscles. And I would add to that list chemical sensitivity and food sensitivity, which we often see in combination with this, which is, I think really fascinating when you look at how much that's rising in children. But anyway, they say whatever its cause, EHS is a real and sometimes disabling problem for the affected persons. Their EMF exposure is generally several orders of magnitude under the limits of internationally accepted standards. Now, I agree with everything said there, but why are they raising this question mark about causality? The reason is because the group that set the guidelines, ICN, IRP, have said the reason they don't need to set lower guideline levels for this group is because they think that this is a psychological reaction. But the problem is, unfortunately, and that would be called the nocebo response. But unfortunately, there are major problems with that explanation. And here are just a few quick ones. When they did surveys, actually, most people with EHS didn't have any fear or concern about these exposures before developing their symptoms. Now, obviously, if fear is going to be the cause of your headache from your phone, then you have to be concerned before you develop those symptoms, and that just wasn't the case. Some people with EHS have demonstrated their reactions under double-blinded conditions, and that completely excludes psychological causes in those individuals. Animal and plant studies have demonstrated effects we've seen some even avoidance behaviours in animals that fit very well with an EHS type reaction in those groups as well. And then further, the mechanisms I spoke about at the beginning are really highly credible for a physical reaction, not a psychological one. And we're seeing those in multiple domains. So unfortunately, this is a growing issue that we need to take seriously, and we need to be considering in childhood populations as well. And those are acute reactions. When we say acute, that means short term. These symptoms can come on very quickly after exposure in sensitive individuals. And I want to thank the Europa EMF Guideline Group who put together this document for prevention, diagnosis and treatment of EMF-related, and that just means electromagnetic field-related health problems and illnesses, including but not limited to electromagnetic hypersensitivity. And this condition is being increasingly recognised. This is one of the groups I work with, International Commission on Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, again, and they have issued this statement pointing out this is now a humanitarian crisis that requires an urgent response, because we have some people that are so severely ill and they can't access hospital care. Some children who can't go to school safely or even access their own home without symptoms. So this is a major problem. And it's also been recognised by this group, the Bioinitiative 2012 group and many others. But it tends to be independent groups, and independence is very important in this particular sphere of medicine and science. Now, this group have 3 former presidents of the Bioelectromagnetic Society, prestigiously. And the reason I point them out is because if you want to go looking for the primary literature base, the original studies, then this is a good place to find big tables like this one of studies showing effects below the current exposure limits. So very useful for you to read that original research if you're interested. Now, after reviewing over 5,000 studies, they pointed out that sensitive populations, including children and those with hypersensitivity, must be protected, recommending that hardwired connections rather than wireless devices are used in schools. Now, at this point, we've talked a bit about biological damage and we've talked about acute or short-term symptoms, but we haven't talked about chronic illness. Now, it's a grayscale. If you don't treat biological damage and acute illness, then you would expect it to at some point progress to a long-term or chronic illness. And some people won't be aware of those acute symptoms, or they'll dismiss them, in which case you can move really straight from biological to chronic. And one of the biological effects, we want to take biological effects really seriously, because that is where preventative medicine happens. By looking at these early stage effects, this is what allows us to stop chronic illness. So it's really important in public health. And this was an EU-funded study, which back in 2004 showed, on the left here, you've got a healthy ball of DNA. It looks a bit like a sun. And in the middle, that's been irradiated with the equivalent of around 1,600 chest x-rays. And you can see all this DNA damage forming a comet-like trail behind the ball of DNA. That is the damage in that trail. And then on the far right, that is just 24 hours of mobile phone radiation below the current allowable guidance limit. So you can see how comparable that is. You can visibly see the DNA damage occurring. Now, because we know that DNA damage, if it's unmanaged, can lead to chronic health effects, we're going to talk about one of the ones that's been most avidly discussed in the media, which is cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer categorized radio frequency radiation as possibly carcinogenic to humans in 2011. That is group 2B, possible carcinogen. And they base this on the fact that people who use their phone more heavily, especially after 10 years of use, have higher rates of a tumor, brain tumor called a glioma. And there's another type of cancer also found to be related at this time, which was schwannoma. So I'd like you to remember those 2 tumors, glioma and schwannoma. Now, in this case, the schwannoma was, the type was an acoustic neuroma, which is in the ear canal. And it was found to be more prevalent on the side the person used their phone as well, increasing the likelihood that that was a genuinely causal link. And so these gliomas and schwannomas were found in heavier cell phone users. Now, what held this back from a higher category, like a group 2A, which would be a probable human carcinogen, or a group 1 known human carcinogen, what held it back was the fact that we hadn't yet got enough animal data. So to give a carcinogen a higher category, you have to see the same cancers reproduced in animal studies, and they didn't feel they had enough data at that time. Now, what was in progress in the background was the National Toxicology Program, a very credible group, US-based, who do studies to look at carcinogenesis. And they did what was at the time the largest animal study ever done to date. And they found clear evidence of heart schwannoma. These animals didn't have phones to their head. They had a whole body exposure from the radiation. And brain glioma, some evidence of that, and adrenal tumours. Now, clear evidence is the highest possible evidence category. Some people commented that that study used very high intensity radiation, and it did use quite high intensity because when you put a phone to your head, your brain does receive a high intensity dose, and we test above the expected high dose. That's how you do toxicology studies. However, this study was published not long after, and this group, the Ramazzini Institute, found the same tumours again, glioma and schwannoma, in their animals that were exposed, this time to far-field radiation, low-intensity radiation of the sort you would expect to see from something like a mobile phone base station exposure. So there are 3 evidence points now: the higher cell phone users getting these tumours, the rats exposed to mobile phone-like radiation, and the rats and mice exposed to low dose, low intensity mobile phone base station type radiation. So at this point, it becomes highly illogical to think that this is some kind of coincidence. And these are fairly rare tumours, so we wouldn't expect to see them by chance in 3 different studies. Now, and there are other studies beyond the ones I've just shared with you that found similar findings. So moving forward in time, that was in around 2018, then the WHO put together a series of systematic reviews to look at evidence from multiple different facets of radiofrequency radiation health. And they wanted this to be comprehensive because the last time they did that for this type of radiation was 93. And they pointed out that they wanted it to be an inclusive and transparent process. Unfortunately, one concern that we have is that the 300 experts who were identified by the WHO to initiate this study were unnamed. So it is not that transparent in that you still can't see who these individuals were. And they're important because they came up with the list of topics and the how crucial these topics were to give the final list of what would be analysed. So from 34 topics suggested to them by the WHO, they added a few free text ones, and then the WHO narrowed it down to only these that you'll see: cancer, EHS, cognitive impairment, birth outcomes, male fertility, oxidative stress, and heat-related effects. Now, unfortunately, the last of these was not completed. The heat-related effects review never happened, and this is problematic because actually heat-related effects form the basis, as I mentioned earlier, of the exposure limits. So it was actually really important for this to be reviewed in light of more recent evidence to say, are those safety limits good at least to guard from heating your tissues above a degree? But that was not performed, that systematic review. Nonetheless, let's look to the others, and I've already shown you this list of the initial long list of subjects, but they had to make some really tough choices out of that big list, and things like they had similar ratings from the experts on both male fertility and brain electrical activity, but they didn't have resources to look at both, so they chose male fertility. And I'm not in any way undermining the importance of that. It's very important, as I'll come on to explain, but so is our brain electrical function. And actually, there is some effect-finding literature in that pool, which very much needs examining. Now, that's not the only problem with these systematic reviews, and the group I work with, ICBE, EMF, have pointed out that we're concerned about the exclusion of relevant studies, reliance on weak and in some cases crucially flawed studies, inappropriate combining of studies, because when you're doing a systematic review and meta-analysis, you're putting lots of studies together and they have to be similarly structured for that to be a meaningful process and for you to be able to draw valid conclusions. And in many cases, these studies were very, what we call heterogeneous. They were completely different. You couldn't really meaningfully analyze them alongside each other. So they should have done they should have done narrative reviews instead of numerical reviews, which is what they did in most cases. But nonetheless, they did find effects in some areas of this literature base. Now, overall, I'll be honest with you, they've said it's quite reassuring. They've also pointed out that in a huge number of these categories, they have very, very low certainty evidence for any of the statements they've made, which is obviously a problem. But despite the reassurances, there are some areas of this that were most certainly not reassuring. And I told you I would speak a little on male fertility. Human observational studies didn't yield much, only very low certainty of evidence. However, the animal studies, there were a lot more of them in this pool, and they saw all of these issues relating to male fertility with statistically significant adverse effects. That's a long list. And they therefore concluded that there were decreases in male fertility that led to reduces in the rate of pregnancy in the experimental animals. They also looked specifically at pregnancy and birth outcomes, and they noted all of these adverse effects, some of them, the starred ones, actually with a linear dose response. So this, again, those kind of observations from these studies increase the likelihood that are not chance findings, that these are significant and need to be considered in the human world. So I want to thank groups like this. This is the Baby Safe project, and if you look them up, they have a lot of information for couples looking to optimize their fertility and optimize the health of their growing child. Now, lastly, in terms of the systematic reviews from the WHO, I'm going to touch on the animal carcinogenicity, because I mentioned to you earlier in the talk how the lack of data in that area was what held back radiofrequency radiation from a higher category at the time, a group 2A or a group 1 known human carcinogen status. Now, the animal studies reviewed very recently, they concluded once again that there was moderate certainty of an effect on glioma of the brains of the animals, and then high certainty of evidence for schwannoma. And this time, as I mentioned with one of the previous studies, this was in the hearts of the animals because they had a whole body exposure. We saw the schwannoma as an acoustic neuroma in the ear canal of the humans. This time the schwannoma was in the hearts of the animals. Now, some people say, well, does it really matter? You know, are rat studies relevant to humans? And the answer is yes, they certainly are. That is what, on some level, justifies the animal studies that are done. And all human carcinogens are found to also be carcinogens in the animal kingdom when the studies are done with correct methodology. So I'll mention now some further findings from those studies that had lower certainty of evidence, but some even rarer tumours, the adrenal glands, pheochromocytomas and hepatoblastomas of the liver, and possible association with lymphomas. So, but the take-home message, all right, it appears to be behaving as a multi-organ carcinogen in animals, but and have effects on fertility. And there were many other domains where it's inconclusive because the evidence was low, but groups such as my own have reviewed much of that evidence and feel that there's a great deal of cause for concern in many other body systems. But the primary take-home message at this point I want to give you is that these findings, these positive findings in animal groups, it makes clear, it invalidates the exposure limits that are currently in place, because these are not tissue heating effects. These are effects that have happened at these low intensities below the allowable limits. They're low intensity effects, and we need to release this outdated dogma that the only thing that can happen negatively is if your body is heated up. It just is not the case. Now, this is relevant to the UK population. This is a publication from Alistair Phillips showing increases in glioblastoma multiforme in England and Wales, and some of that is happening in young groups. And these are tumours that we currently do not know how to treat. They have a 5-year survival that is incredibly low. They're fortunately relatively rare tumours, but as you've seen from my previous slides, many of the other issues I'm talking about are not rare, you know, from the acute effects like headaches and sleep disturbance, palpitations, dizziness, through to some of the other chronic effects like problems with fertility, and many more beyond the scope of this talk. But this group, again, highly credible. Anthony Miller, previous advisor to the WHO, pointed out quite a few years ago now that actually this group felt the evidence satisfied the criteria for an elevated status, a group 2A probable carcinogen or a group 1 known human carcinogen. But IARC haven't yet reassessed what state this should be, not since 2011. Now, you might be saying to yourself now, well, if the International Agency for Research on Cancer is concerned that brain cancer might be caused by radiofrequency radiation, and brain cancer is a leading cause of cancer death in children now, which it is, I'm afraid to say, then why aren't we being warned to restrict their use? Now, the answer is you are. It's just on a rather obscure NHS leaflet that you've probably never seen. And I'm just going to, there's lots of reassurances on this leaflet, but they also say in there, and I'll just enlarge this, that children and young people should be encouraged to use their phone for only essential purposes and keep calls short. And furthermore, the UK government has this website pointing out how to reduce your exposure from radio waves. And they again say children should not be using phones. Adults, you should make your own choices, but from an informed position. And I'm really concerned about that because, yes, I'd love adults to be doing this from an informed position, but I'm really concerned that actually the true situation in terms of the scientific literature has not been disseminated to the public. And they go on to give you some very useful and some less useful advice about how to reduce your exposure. So they say move the phone away from the body as when texting to lower the exposure. Now, I am concerned about that because, yes, moving it away from the body does lower exposure. But when texting, children often will rest their device on their abdomen or pelvis. And that, yes, it reduces the exposure to the head, but it increases the exposure to the delicate abdominopelvic organs, including their reproductive organs that we've just been discussing. They advise you to use a hands-free kit. Again, I have some concerns here because some hands-free kits use Bluetooth headsets, use Bluetooth that is emitting right in your ear canal, very close to your brain. And the intensity your brain receives is inversely proportional to the square of the distance away. And what that translates to is even small distances drop the intensity of exposure very dramatically. But when it's that close to the brain, that increases the exposure you're being exposed to. They say keep calls short, very sensible, and make calls where the network signals are strong. Well, I understand why they say that, but you might not. This is because if you have a very strong signal, if you've got 5 bars on your phone has adaptive power control and it can down-regulate its own power, so thereby lessening the dose to your brain. So you get a higher exposure from the cell tower, but less from the phone. And the phone is closer to you, so it's the more important of the 2 exposures. Choose a phone with a low SAR, specific absorption rate, they say. as quoted by the manufacturer. I'm sure very few people know how to find that information, but you have to look it up. Again, though, people don't know that they should be doing that. And lastly, they state that in terms of exposure from devices held further away from the body, and then they say, such as wireless-enabled laptops, you don't need to worry. Now, I've got a real problem with that sentence because laptops do what they say on the can. They are often used on the lap, particularly by children and adolescents. And again, that increases the dose to the abdominopelvic organs. And then they go on to talk about other things that are certainly further away, like transmitting antennas. And they say you don't need to worry about those because they're so far away. But again, I don't feel that we can be reassured in the same way because of the studies on low intensity radiation, like the Ramazzini Institute study, which showed the same tumours from far field radiation. So many, including myself, are concerned that exposures could be relatively high in the public domain in schools, particularly because there are so many devices in such a small area. And therefore, some groups are starting to do school studies where they measure radiation levels and give advice to schools to help them lower the exposures to children and staff. And this one was done with body-worn exposimeters that you can just wear and go to school, and they come back with data that's then analysed. And what these studies generally show us is that everything depends on the IT infrastructure within the school generally, that there are ways of doing it that reduce exposure and ways of doing it that can dramatically increase that exposure. And it's when students are streaming, are downloading a lot of information, like imagine all of the children in the class are using an iPad to look at a video on YouTube, something like that. The uplink and combined downlink with that can create quite a lot of radiation in their environment. Now, this is one of these common misconceptions. Many people think, well, we'll move the router. When they're positioning things in their school, they think, well, move the router further away from the children, and that'll be good. And then there'll be such low intensity radiation, there'll be no effect. Now, we've already talked about the fact that low intensity radiation has been shown in some studies to be an issue. But you also have to think about the fact that the router should only be there if it's really helping the children. And if that's why it's there, then they're holding the device that they're using to communicate with the router. So their device is like a small router itself. It's sending information back. And that is where they get the bulk of their exposure from. Now, it's also a bit more complicated in that there are intensity windows, as we call them, where in some studies it's shown that the low intensity radiation has had more of a biological effect than the high intensity radiation. Unusual, but we do see effects like this. We're not seeing always linear responses. And just to make it even more complex, there are things you have to consider all the dynamics of the field. So the frequency, the cumulative exposure, the shape of the signal. And in a classroom where you've got lots of devices all emitting at the same time, you can have constructive interference where you've got ever-changing fields, and you may have hotspots that happen so briefly it'd be hard to even measure them. So it's a complex situation. Now, I've shared a lot of science, and I recognise not everyone in this audience are scientists. So, and I also have a lot of empathy. I think this must actually be really difficult for parents and schools, because on the one hand, they're receiving a huge amount of reassurance from governmental groups and some other organisations that say you really don't need to worry. And then some doctors and scientists like myself are saying, actually, we're really concerned and we think now is the time we have to protect children. And who do you believe and what do you do and how far do you go? And it's a tricky one, but I think I just want to share some evidence that isn't from the scientific community. It comes from elsewhere, but it's important to take lots of different sources of information when you're making decisions. And this is the Italian Supreme Court ruling that a brain tumour was caused by a mobile phone. This was many years ago now, but there have been several more rulings showing the same outcome. And there's also been successful legal action regarding EHS. So including here in the UK, where a child with electromagnetic hypersensitivity has been accommodated by way of an education healthcare plan, an EHCP, mandating a low EMF environment for that child. And there are other cases over the world. This is an important one. So insurance companies are risk analysts. That is their raison d'etre. And they will lose a lot of money if they make these calls wrong. So they spend a lot of time assessing risk, and they will not indemnify for health effects of radio frequency radiation. And I'm not aware of any companies now that will. And I think this is something really important to consider in school. Because who's accountable? If a child becomes ill with something that can be credibly linked to EMF exposure in the classroom, who is accountable for that? We don't want that scenario. That is why I spend time lecturing, because that is what we need to avoid. And I think in terms of who's accountable, that will unfold. I honestly don't know the answer. These legal cases, I'm sad to say, I think will be coming. Then iPhone recalls. So many of you might remember that a few years ago, the iPhone 12 was recalled. And the reason was because it exceeded the EU safety limits. Now, these are the safety limits that are designed to protect against thermal heating effects that myself and the groups I work with do not feel are protecting general health. And even those over relaxed limits were breached by this phone when it was close to the body. So in response, Apple updated their software to reduce radiation, but initially they only did that in France. Now that fix will be EU-wide, but of course that doesn't cover us here in the UK. In the US, the radiation levels emitted by some of these phones are predicted to exceed limits by up to 11 times. And about 60 different models have been withdrawn because of this issue. So, unfortunately, this is how things unravel. And some groups like this are now offering no win, no fee for Wi-Fi injury cases. Now, I want to bring this back into the domain of school for a moment and just point out that as parents, you sign consent forms all the time. You also risk analyze all the time. Every time you put your child in a car, you know that that's a risky thing, but the risk versus benefit is what you feel comfortable with. And in my former job in accident and emergency in the UK NHS, I had to often ask people to sign consent forms, and it was my duty to share with them the up-to-date science on any risk. Now, if we were going to write a consent form for Wi-Fi in children's classrooms and on their laps with their gadgets, it would have to have all of this information and more in order for us to say that people were truly informed of the science, the risk, the data. And there's many other things that could be added to a list. Now, I feel really uncomfortable when I look at that. And it just feels like there's been a huge disconnect between the science and the reality of everyday life, especially for our kids. Now, I show this because I talked to you about, well, you calculate risk versus benefit. We do risky things with kids all the time, but we do that when we think the benefit outweighs the risk. And this is the OECD pointing out that in their opinion from this study, actually computers themselves weren't really improving learning. You know, the way children learn best is to see your face, to feel your passion, to interact with you as a human. That's how they were designed to learn. And some children can find it very difficult to learn from a screen. So I'm not at all surprised about that report. But just to be clear, I'm not advocating that we suddenly take all computers out of schools. What I am saying is that we can actually provide internet access and for children at school using hardwired alternatives. We don't need to use radiation to give them internet. So on that note, moving forward and talking about some solutions. But, you know, before we do, I also don't want you to think that I'm a lone voice in this, because there are organisations of medical doctors and scientists all over the world appealing for better protection for our children. And what do they mean by that? Well, they're asking for a reduction in exposure from all of these common everyday devices and more. And this is the American Academy of Pediatrics pointing out that they want to see hardwired connections in schools. And I want to just highlight this because there's some very strong wording in this paper from the Cyprus Medical Association and Austrian medical chambers saying that they recognize carcinogenicity, developmental neurotoxicity, effects on DNA, fertility, hypersensitivity, all occurring at extremely low intensities, lower than existing limits, and that those damages could be serious and in some cases irreversible. They ask that wireless networks should be prohibited in schools, particularly with younger children, and wired connections should be adopted. And they want to see parents empowered. I do feel really sad when I have seen really well-educated, often scientific parents who have read the literature here and approach their school and say, actually, I'm not happy about this. And sometimes have a real barrier to that discussion from the school. And I think that's deeply wrong. It's really important for schools. Schools are supposed to do a proper risk assessment every time they make a change in a school environment. And this was just absent on this issue. It was sort of considered it was done and taken care of by higher authorities, and schools abdicated to those groups. But when a parent, or certainly a group of parents as well, asks for this to be looked at and risk assessed, that should be taken really seriously. And some schools have done that, and they have decided, actually, we'd rather not take this risk. We recognise we don't have to for ourselves, our own bodies, and for our children. We would like to go ahead and put hardwired infrastructure in our school to reduce our exposure, and highly commend those schools. And just going back, I'm going to talk through these mitigation strategies. So aeroplane mode that you see on the left here, flight mode, that no longer disables all of the emissions from your device. And I will explain more on that. The fiber optic cable there is hard wiring, and Ethernet cable is what you use to replace the radio frequency. And shielding can be used to mitigate exposures that are outside the school environment, perhaps from a master antenna if you don't want that in the classroom. Now, just pointing out that schools are very rapidly banning phones, very rapidly, obviously a hot topic. Now, I recognise they're doing this for reasons of social media concerns and addiction, etc., distraction. Quite rightly, they're doing that. But since the phones are being taken away from the students, it's a golden opportunity to reduce risk on two different fronts and put those phones in a Faraday box so that the radiation from them is not affecting the people around them. And this is a slide, I'll be honest, I've focused in this particular presentation highlighting the problem and the evidence for concern. Really talking through practical solutions for schools is almost a whole lecture in itself, but this is a very quick set of bullet points that can help with safer phone use both in school and outside of school. So the take-home message really from this is you need to disable everything that so that's flight mode for the phone signal, but then it's Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are done separately in the settings part of your phone. And it may look to you when you use flight mode like they've gone off, but if you go into settings, you'll find actually they're still on. So you need to disable everything very carefully. The other option is if you're on the move, you could put your phone, just pop it into a Faraday pouch. If it's a good quality one and it properly functions, then it should stop those emissions coming out of the pouch. Your own phone in the information section probably tells you to avoid carrying that phone directly on your body when it's active. And I've mentioned a few different tumour types from the recent WHO SRs, but actually there is a case series published by breast surgeon John West showing breast tumours directly behind where women carried phones in their bras. Please don't carry active phones directly against your body like that. And I've put here beware headsets because as I mentioned earlier, Bluetooth headsets emit RF right into the ear canal. Hardwire your phone when you're at home at work. Now, this is a great trick that very few people know you can do, but you can actually disable everything on your phone in terms of wireless and then plug it in using Ethernet cabling with an adapter and still use data calling, so WhatsApp and other forms of data calling and surf the internet, etc. Landlines at home, I would advocate you replace them with either conference calling speakerphones if you want to be hands-free, or if you want privacy, you can have an old-fashioned corded landline. If you have to walk about while you're on the phone, then I would recommend a low radiation eco-depth model, which only emits radiation when you're actually using it. At least it doesn't emit the rest of the time like the normal versions do. Safer computer and tablet use is much the same. You have to disable everything, both on the laptop computer or tablet and also in the router. And that is much harder than it may sound. It sounds straightforward, but some computers have a button that says Wi-Fi off, which it will stop you using it. But if you use a radiation meter, you'll see that actually it's still being emitted. And the same with the router. Often when you disable your router, your provider will turn it back on remotely. They can and they do that. It's so that they, I think, can provide a sort of cloud of internet for other users. But unfortunately, I would recommend that you need to check things with meters to see what is emitting in your household and what isn't. And TVs, smart TVs, nowadays there's many different smart appliances and they will all have their own emissions. And then there's a little bit further down on here that's just about general good practice. And I think using screen color changing software to reduce the blue light component, especially in the evening, is a good idea. Grounding it to reduce the low frequency fields, that's beyond the scope of this talk, but just to make sure your computer is well grounded. And this slide is just pointing out lots of different ways in which half measures can be helpful. And now I want to be clear, these are good things to do. Okay, they are good. Every household or school has to take a stepwise approach. Many of them have gone so far down the line of wireless use, it's actually really difficult to unpick that and go a different direction. So I'm not saying these aren't good things to do. These are definitely good things to do. It's a set of steps which can help you to lower exposure. However, I do think that all of this lowering of exposures is a bit like saying, you know, have a low tar cigarette, that's okay. If this is found to be a carcinogen, a known carcinogen, even if it's in the probable bracket, arguably, but I think even now, with the status it's at now and the evidence we have, what we should be aiming for is no exposure, where we can achieve that. And we can achieve that in school in many cases. So I think defensible protection is to immediately be switching things off when they're not in use and disabling the emissions, and then as quickly as possible withdrawing all RF emissions and moving to hardwired systems in school. So in summary, radio frequency radiation below limits can induce serious biological damage. Present safety standards must be revised. Children are especially vulnerable, and hardwired internet services can immediately be used to protect children at school. Thank you so much for listening. These are some resources that I think are really helpful, and they come at this issue from a number of different angles. So you'll find, as I mentioned, the core literature there that you can read at source, plus a lot of very digestible information on many of these for the non-scientists to be able to absorb. Thank you so much, and thank you to the group who invited me here today. I really hope it's been helpful, and I'm happy now to answer any questions that you've got.